Being the only child in my family, I spent a lot of time by myself outside. A lot more time playing outside than most of my friends, as a matter of fact. While many of them would be involved in their Xboxes and PlayStations, I was always trying to get the better out of what nature had to offer me as a child. Our home was sitting on the outskirts of town, and it backed up to a very, very large wooded area. My parents were pretty strict about me being outside. I had to be within sight at all times, or they would come looking for me. However, I still went out and about and explored on my own. They said they would have to come looking for me, but they hardly if ever did. I think those rules were bent quite a bit. I spent hours every day exploring inside this wooded area, hence why I say my parents' rules were pretty well bent. It was like my own little world I could get lost in. On this particular story, it was early in the fall, but it felt like late summer. You know, when it's not too hot, but it's not too cold. Probably about 70 degrees and sunny. There were leaves starting to fall, but it hadn't got yet that crisp air that fall brings. It was maybe around 6 or 7 p.m. I can't remember exactly, but the sun was just beginning to set. I had heard my parents calling for me from inside the house. I knew it was dinner time. So I was maybe no more than 100 or 200 feet tucked into the woods. I began to walk back out the forest, picking up speed as my stomach began to grumble. But as I got closer to the fence line into our backyard, I stopped at the edge of this clearing, just in front of our back patio or yard area, when I could see something strange in the neighbor's yard. This made me stop dead in my tracks. Whatever it was, an animal, I assume, was standing next to their shed behind their home, kind of crouched over. It looked like a large ape, but with a dog head. I came to that conclusion because of the ears and the shape of the head. Then, in that same moment, I heard something large from behind me approaching. As I turned around, this creature, or animal, was also dog-like in appearance, but unlike the other thing that I saw, had no fur at all. Its entire body was bare, and it appeared to be covered in this gross, mangy-looking skin. The whole thing just looked wrong. I could feel my stomach drop, and this rush of adrenaline hit me as I heard the animal behind me start growling. I realized it was already too late to run past this creature in front of me, so I crouched down into a tense position, ready for whatever may come next. This thing looked different than the other creature over by the shed. They did look similar, but this thing looked at me like it was pleased that I was going to be its next meal. I'm still shocked at how quietly it snuck up on me. My mother called out again for me, and as soon as the creature heard her voice, it stopped like it was surprised, looking in the direction of her voice. It then turned around and began jumping over logs, running through trees at a speed I couldn't understand, until it vanished into the forest on the far side of our neighbor's yard. I heard whatever was the same strange creature by the shed in my neighbor's yard follow after it. I was so terrified. I remember I peed my pants. Of course, after going in, my mother just kept laughing at me. Couldn't understand for the faintest reason why I had peed myself and why I was so scared. I played it off, of course, and never told her. I knew she would never believe me. This encounter has been so terrifying. I have never really explored in the forest around my neighborhood, not since that day. I have never told or said anything to my neighbor after that either. Come to think of it, after this, I don't recall seeing these strange animals again. I'm posting this here because it seems appropriate and a good spot to share my weird experiences that I had to endure when I was younger. Everybody who reads this, please stay safe. It was about 11 p.m., and I was walking home from work. It had gotten dark outside by this time, but there was a full moon that night. It illuminated the surrounding area pretty well. I was walking down the side of the road, as there is no sidewalk, when I heard what sounded like loud growling from behind. I turned around to see what in fact was this thing, running at me, with its head very low to the ground, but coming in my direction. It looked very tall and skinny from a distance, but its size must have been close to that of an average adult, if not larger. It had very large arms, muscular, even though the torso was very slender. The closer this thing got, the louder it began breathing. It kind of had this rhythmic tone to it. It stopped, staring at me for several seconds, before quickly walking off. I could hear it moving through the woods in my direction, right next to me, and I realized it had walked into the forest next to me, to stay concealed, following me, paralleling me in the woods. It was now approaching me, almost at a 90-degree angle from the trees, so it could stay hidden. I began panicking, not sure what my next move should or could be, or what exactly I was dealing with. I was convinced that in this moment, this was a demon. I remained frozen where I stood, hearing it come closer and closer in the darkening woods. Once it got about 20 or so feet from me, I knew I had no choice but to flee, or I'd be a goner. I didn't think I could outrun it, so I quickly turned to my right, booked it back the way I came, towards my house. I ran as hard as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often, while expecting this thing to be not far behind. It felt like an eternity until I passed the tree line for the side of the road and entered into a more open area again, where there were houses with people living in them. They were still at least a quarter mile before I was finally able to reach my street. That's when all the sounds stopped behind me, and I began hearing a strange mechanical whirring noise, coming from somewhere nearby, but could not see where it was coming from. The sound grew louder, moving closer by, and this loud mechanical humming noise that just seemed to come from everywhere. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I continued to push hard and run. That's when, with the full moon now behind me, I suddenly saw something moving beside my house, about 50 or so feet in front of me. It was a tall black silhouette that stood out against all the light around it. It was this translucent figure. It looked like something from another world. I knew at this point, whatever this thing was, it seemed to be targeting me, specifically in watching its movement as best I could, while darting between two houses nearby, where there were jagged piles of rock blocking my path. The kind of rocks that people put in front or the side of their house for decoration. It's hard to explain. I quickly made it back into my house, locking everything. My parents were crashed out, so they didn't hear or see anything. Of course, the rest of that night was very stressful. I would see these strange, mysterious lights shining into my window. Even though I'm on the second story, I would hear strange growling outside my house, and these bizarre sounds, mechanical noises, humming, heavy footsteps, thumping, pounding, and other bizarre strange noises I can't exactly explain. I don't know if I had an alien encounter or what on earth I experienced this night. It is hands down the most frightening thing I have ever gone through to date. It was 7 p.m., and a family was driving down a lonely road in the middle of Maine. It was a Friday night, and it looked like they were going to have the house all to themselves for the rest of the weekend. But what happened 1 hour later, as they drove home, changed their lives forever. They saw something crossing the street ahead of them. At first, they thought that it might be an injured dog or cat, and stopped to see if it was okay. But as they got closer, it became pretty apparent. This animal-looking creature actually, to their horror, had human-like features, but with this thick, dense fur covering it. This made them scared, so they decided to step on the gas and get away from there as fast as possible. One day after this incident, people began reporting the same creature but in other areas. Some people claimed that it was a werewolf, while others just said that it was a bear who walked upright. There have also been several reports of this creature, but no one has managed to get any clear pictures or even videos of what is truly going on. All we know is that this thing is very large. It has also been seen in many different locations. We just ask anyone who's seen it. For example, this Dogman creature was also seen in Michigan back in 1987 by two campers. They saw something chasing a deer, which they then witnessed this big tall monster on its hind legs. They said it looked just like a wolf, an upright walking wolf. It had a strong canine head, black fur, and very overly sized arms, more resembling that of a man than a dog. Since then, I've heard of reports of people seeing this creature more often in different parts of the world. Canada, for example. 3 people I know personally saw these creatures walking on their hind legs. I also have connections in Virginia, where people have reported seeing this werewolf-like being heavily around 2002 to 2005. Apparently, it tried to attack people living nearby, but always ran off when somebody spotted him or her. This creature can be around 7 feet tall and has been known to be very violent. It also kills animals like horses and cattle, so if you see it, call for help and stay away from these creatures. They can be incredibly dangerous. I had a pretty horrific encounter back in 2014 during the late fall. I don't believe in werewolves or things like that, but I had a strange encounter with this being that closely resembled one. It looked like it came from Hollywood. Anyhow, here's my encounter. I was walking down my street. It was about 6 a.m., and since I didn't have a car, I was on my way to work. I remember it was raining lightly, and because of the time of year, it was still pretty dark. I had my hood over my head, and this large shape caught the corner of my eye. As I turned to look up, there was this large figure, and it didn't really make much sense. It looked like a man covered in long hair, hung down all over his body, standing, looking at one of the upper branches in an oak tree. The smell hit my nose as soon as I saw it. It was like old eggs and rotting meat. Strange but very specific smelling. It stuck out to me at first because of this thing. It just looked so out of place. But due to the haze of the rain and how dark it was, I couldn't really register what exactly it was. Then, it stops and looks over at me, and I stopped, dead in my tracks, because all I could see is this silhouette and these 2 glowing orbs of light. What's crazy is that moment we made eye contact. This just feeling, this jolt of fear shot through my body. Now, it's not a normal fear like what you feel when you see something go wrong. But I knew that this was an immense danger, and whatever this was could destroy me without even trying. Or so that's the emotion it relayed. Its eyes were so bright, glowing, the same way a deer's does when it's hit with headlights. But except it was that way all the time. I can think about as I looked at this thing, how much it reminded me of something straight out of a movie. It just stood there for a moment, staring at me, staying still. It didn't make an expression, at least not that I could see. And then, after some time, it slowly turned, walking into this very small alleyway. And I realized it was out in the open and was trying to hide itself. Now, I was out in the open. There could be more of these things. But I was firmly planted in this one spot, frozen, unable to move. There's this thing that happens to your mind when you endure something like this. There's no words to really explain it, except true fear. A kind of primal fear your body only experiences once. There's a few shortcomings to what I can accurately explain. When you're in a situation like that, your mind isn't thinking about how you should be reacting. And furthermore, it's not the kind of thing you could just be brushed off and forgotten. I remember my legs feeling weak, my body entirely numb at first, before this strange rush of energy hit me, and I'd been ejected out of a slingshot. The second it happened, I took off. I ran home as fast as possible without looking back once, until after I got inside, which is when reality really began to set in on what had actually occurred only moments before. It's one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me, but for some reason, this is the most vivid memory I actually have. Now, I was so terrified, I had to call my boss and tell him he had to come pick me up. He was pissed, but he understood. I just told him there was an emergency and lied. I've never had any other encounters with anything else, like this one, but sometimes I think back to that evening, or morning, and wonder what exactly it was. I'm not sure how anybody could attribute what I saw to anything other than a werewolf, or maybe a mythical but real creature. I understand. It all sounds crazy when you say it out loud, and definitely doesn't fit the typical description of something so simple, like a dog. To this day, I've never heard somebody tell me about seeing something similar, until recently, when I had several friends on social media start posting their own stories and experiences with this strange canine creature in their hometown. It got me thinking again about my experiences from long ago. These are friends who don't believe in the paranormal, friends who don't acknowledge what a cryptid is. Although, I don't even know what it is that I experienced. I'm not trying to sound like some kind of kook or anything, but those eyes, that hair, and that smell, it's gonna stick with me. I just hope this isn't a sign of things to come, and maybe it's just a fluke, or something entirely separate from everything else going on in the world right now. But for some reason, I have this terrible feeling I won't be the last time I see it. My boyfriend and I were driving on a back road in northern Maine. We saw something terrible. We were traveling along a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by trees as far as the eye could see, white snow on the ground. On our right was a ravine. On our left is where we saw it. It was hairy, had short ears, and walked like a man, but stood kind of like an ape, hunched over. Had a very strange gait, too. It also had a canine head. I thought it was a bear at first, or maybe a deer. After all, we were deep in the woods, so seeing a bear or deer isn't that unusual, right? Well, my boyfriend starts driving faster after he looked at what he pulled its head out from drinking the water in the streams. And he said to me, "Did you see that thing?" I only got to catch a glimpse, but I can tell you that this wasn't a bear or a deer. My boyfriend isn't a very experienced hunter, so he can definitely debunk a misidentification. This wasn't it. We were both so scared, we didn't talk about it until a day later. I have no idea what this creature was. I don't care what people say. I know what we saw, and we both have each other to verify the sighting. It has to be investigated further. Like I said, this wasn't a bear or a coyote, or a deer. I have never known of a species of canine that stands upright. If you do, please let me know. But to my knowledge, a species like that doesn't exist, period, let alone in the state of Maine. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was walking back from my boyfriend's house about 12 in the morning. We weren't even together yet, at least publicly. I knew his parents didn't care. At the time, he lived about 15 minutes away from me. It wasn't a very high-traffic neighborhood where he lived. That made me feel safer. Safer than usual, I should say, to be outside alone at such a very early hour. I hadn't gone very far when I noticed that there was movement behind me. I didn't pay much attention to it, as there are dogs and animals out at night. At least a lot of strays, I should say. I've seen at least 4 or 5 of them. So thinking it was a stray dog and it being a little dark, I couldn't get the best view. But as the noise grew right behind me, I turned, and the first thing that struck my mind, as crazy as this sounds, was a werewolf, because of the way it looked. But it was running on all 4s. And this thing runs over in my direction, but turns almost at a 100-degree angle, and kind of cuts me off. This more than scared me, more than I could really handle. So I fled, and I got all the way back home, and I told my now boyfriend that I don't know if it was going to work, at least leaving so early in the morning. He vouched to walk home with me at night, told me that he'd tell his parents that he was going to walk his friend home. And while that made me feel safer, I can't help but digest the fact that I saw a flipping werewolf. I told him that, and he tried to calm me down and just explain that it was probably just a large dog, and the shadows played a trick on me. Even as the weeks went on, he still gave me crap for it, mentioning, "Do you really stand by the fact that you believe you saw a werewolf?" And I would always tell him yes, that's exactly what this looked like. He grew more and more concerned as time went on because he would tell me he'd hear strange noises in his neighborhood at night, and a lot of the stray dogs would soon go missing in the coming weeks. Now, just as kind of a retrospective look on the story, I have no idea if there's any correlation to the dogs and animals going missing and what I saw that night and the noises he had been hearing. But either way, it was enough to kind of scare him, because I think he started believing me. Especially at first, he started off making fun of me. Well, his tune changed up quite a bit. Then fast forward another month, and all the cats and dogs in the neighborhood were virtually gone. Something else to note is that this neighborhood isn't some out in the middle of nowhere place. It's just a little suburban neighborhood, nowhere near any woods or anything. In fact, there's a pretty busy intersection about a quarter-mile away, and a major highway in the other direction. So, again, I have no idea what any of all this means. And unless werewolves are real, or there is such thing as giant wolves that look freaky, then maybe that's what him and I saw. Let me start this off by saying that I never thought in my life I'd experience something like this. It's certainly been pretty interesting. I was having a friend stay the weekend. We were out walking about, 1 a.m. This was in late July. We were just taking in the wonderful summer night air, enjoying each other's company. It was particularly warm out, considering it was late July. You know how it can be during the early morning hours. Still pretty residually hot. There wasn't really anybody else around, seeing we were on the far end of a park by ourselves. Off in the distance, past some trees, I could see a light though. It kind of looked like it might be coming from a house, but there was no noise. And suddenly, what appeared to be this large black dog jumps out from behind this tree, running full speeds toward us. We both were startled, leaping back and running. It got pretty close to us and started growling, but then stopped dead in its tracks, about 15 feet from us. This wolf or dog was incredibly massive. If I've ever used the term dire wolf, this would have been it. Easily the size of a lion, larger than a Great Dane, the biggest dog I'd ever seen. I remember this. It matched up perfectly with the darkness surrounding it. We both ran. We weren't going to take our chances with whatever this hellhound was. Anyway, when we got back to our house, we kept turning around to make sure it never followed us, and it never did. We got back and my friend's dad was really drunk. got mad at us for being noisy coming in the house. We tried to explain that there was a person chasing us, but he just told us to stop smoking weed and go to bed. Of course, we didn't smoke weed at all. This was something I can't get out of my mind. Was this a hellhound, or was this something else? I am a paranormal investigator, and I've gotten some reports of some recent sightings happening in Michigan. The witness I was speaking to was walking home from work late one evening. He claims he heard a rustling sound coming up from behind him. He turned to see what the source of the noise was and saw something that terrified him. He claims he saw this thing moving towards him on two legs, running like a man, but it wasn't. He knows what he saw. It didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. He described seeing an upright-like canine figure, covered in black fur, except for its face, which had human-like features, such as eyes and large teeth, but also had sharp claws on its hands, and these massive fangs. He claimed to be so terrified by the sight that he dropped his cell phone, running home as fast as he could. He didn't go out at night anymore, unless he had a friend with him. Now, over the past few years, sightings of black creatures resembling wolfmen have become increasingly common. These rumors lead to an online community dedicated to proving that Dogman is real. This group collected data on reported Dogman sightings in order to try and prove there were more than just anecdotal evidence of these beings' existence. They pointed towards the fact that there were well over 100 reports within the last 7 years alone. That's a rate of about 2 or 3 every month. In addition, most witnesses claim that they've seen a Dogman in areas where there have been reports of other known Dogman sightings. They have also pointed to closer instances, like one that happened to Gabe in 2016, and even closer than was a Dogman attack that happened just last year. In the case, there were 2 victims claiming they were attacked by a human creature. They say human because of how closely it resembled a man. It had long claws and actually tore its way into the house. It's reported that this thing ended up chasing the family out of the house before they ran by to a neighbor's house for safety. And although they aren't exactly sure what attacked them, both family individuals swear that it bore features resembling those of a human, while also possessing canine qualities. Since my daughter is a junior in high school, she often has late-night practices with her theater group. On performance nights, sometimes she wouldn't finish until close to midnight, especially when it is a winter show. I always insist on driving her home. This night, it was around 11:30 p.m. It was stormy, and it was December. There were only a few days left until the holiday break, and of course, like any good holiday, we were due for snow. But for now, it was just wet, cold, and windy. I was worried about power lines or trees coming down, but the only way back home from the school involved going past some woods. I made sure I used my husband's truck, took it slow down windy roads. My kid was still high on adrenaline from the show, chattering non-stop in a way that teen girls seem to have perfected, when suddenly, I saw something run out in front of us. I slammed on the brakes. We skidded to a complete stop right in front of this thing, which had raced out of the trees on one side of the road, but decided it would stay right smack bang in the middle and risk me flattening it. My daughter did scream, but we did not hit it. Must have missed it by a whisker. Whatever it was had bounded out of the trees on 4 legs, as you would expect from any type of creature. It was big. In the blind panic of braking, I hadn't really paused to consider exactly what it could be. The most plausible guess, of course, was a deer. Now, in the dim beam of the headlights, I really couldn't tell for certain. but the only thing that made a lick of sense was that it was a really abnormally large wolf. We do have them in these parts, although it is highly unusual to ever see one. They are usually found much closer to the mountains. I was still catching my breath, just thanking God that I hadn't hit the thing. As much for our own sake as the animals, it would have likely totaled the truck. When my daughter said, "Mom, what was that thing?" I was about to reply that it was just a wolf, and although they could be dangerous, we were safe in the vehicle, no doubt. It would just run off any second. That's when I saw movement out of the windshield, right there in front of both of us. The wolf stood up on two legs, like a person. We sat there just gawping at this thing. I could see that it was quite comfortable on two legs. Not like when your pet dog is begging for a treat for a second or two. This creature's body looked right, stood up, and that was when it dawned on me that despite being hairy, the body and limbs were very much like a human. But that head, there was nothing human about that. Now that it was facing us, we had a much better view. I could see it wasn't a wolf at all, but a dog actually. More like a German shepherd. Piercing amber eyes. And it made this horrible noise. I guess it was a howl, but it sounded like a child's scream. High-pitched. And then, as quick as it had originally raced out of the tree line, it sped off again through the woods on the opposite side of the road. We sat there for about another minute, catching our breath, and then I continued to drive carefully home. Being a teen, as soon as we got home, my daughter began Googling, asking people on her social media accounts, and before long, she was convinced she had seen a Dogman. Having read through some of the descriptions other people have given, I had to agree. Knowing that so many other people out there had witnessed one of these creatures was both comforting as to solidify the fact that I'm not going mad, but it also fills me with dread. We have no choice but to travel through those woods, and sometimes late at night. But when possible, I get my husband to do it, or I ask my daughter to stay with a friend. I really don't want to ever see that thing again, or anything like it. I'm a trucker, and often make long trips across the country, sometimes lasting weeks. I always sleep in the rig, and have been doing this for several years now. Whilst it isn't exactly a 5-star accommodation, I'll never get used to relying on gas station restrooms to keep clean. It is a job, and it helps pay for my family. It can get pretty lonely on these longer trips, but these days, I got the advantage of podcasts and audiobooks. Usually, I drive until I just can't anymore, then find a truck stop. Sometimes, though, it has just been on the side of the road, as long as it is safe, of course. It was one of those times when this incident occurred. I'd been on the road for hours, trying to find somewhere decent to pull over and stop for the night, but there was nothing for miles around. Just trees and timber as far as the eye could see. This was in the Pacific Northwest, although I forget where. I do remember there being a huge Christmas farm nearby. You'd have seen the plenty of amenities too, but it seemed like this particular stretch of road I was on was strictly the basics. Eventually, I found a rather safe spot when the road had widened. I could park up safely with the knowledge that, in a highly unlikely chance, somebody else needed to pass by me, they could do so safely, securely, without crashing into me. I shut my eyes, and I remember being out. Maybe around 2 a.m., very still outside. I was pretty pissed when I woke up suddenly. Having been doing this for years, I've gotten used to sleeping through all sorts, and it usually takes a lot of commotion to wake me after I've fallen into an exhausted slumber. I'm a heavy sleeper, what can I say? So, what could possibly be making all that noise in this completely empty stretch of road. It sounded like a screaming, maybe like a kid. But I have plenty of hunting buddies who would tell you that there are several animals out there who can mimic noises, akin to a woman being murdered. I don't know much about that, but I guess there's such things as mountain lions that can do that. Therefore, I wasn't worried that I was witnessing some middle-of-nowhere serial killer. But I did want whatever the hell was out there to be quiet. I needed to go back to sleep. I was staring out of the window, thinking I can give a nice long blast on the air horn and maybe scare whatever it was out there making a racket, when I saw movement from outside the vehicle. Whatever the creature was, it had come out of the trees and seemed to be standing right next to the truck. Have you ever been in a country lane in the middle of the night? No streetlights out there. It was completely dark. Yet, I instinctively knew that something was off. You see, although I could only make the outline of the animal, it was tall since I could see the head from the cab of my truck. That shouldn't have been possible. It didn't seem to be moving. Whatever it was, just stood still in front of the road. So, I carefully flicked on the engine, just enough to turn the lights on. I got a full view of just what was out there. The lights blinded it for a second, and it let out another one of those darn screams. It was even worse with it being closer, but the sound I could account for. What made no sense at all was how large this creature seemed to be. As I said, it was tall, around 6.5 to 7 feet, at a guess. A very stocky body, kind of like that of a pro footballer. And said body was very much like a guy's, stacked, hairy, very large muscly limbs in proportion, the same as a human. But the head. I'm not very good at identifying breeds of dog, but when I got home after this, I looked up and can confirm that this thing had the head of a Doberman Pinscher. Again, totally in proportion to the size of a human-looking body, but completely and totally canine. It also appeared to be grinning at me. At least, that was what it looked like. If you can try at all to imagine a dog's face manipulated into a very human-looking expression, if it hadn't already been something that had messed with my mind, I'd never forget. That eerie and out-of-place grin cemented it. I honked on the horn as hard as I could, giving it a good blast. There was chaos around for a minute or two, birds taking off out of the trees. I heard various other critters sounding their displeasure. A deer made it to cross the road, took one look at the creature still in front of me, and did a sort of backwards leap, back into the trees from where it came. With that, the Dogman gave another high-pitched howl, and then leapt after the deer. That leap in and of itself should not have been possible. It would have been Olympic-worthy. I didn't even look at the clock, just slammed my foot on the gas, and was out of there as fast as I could get my rig to move. I drove for about another hour until I found a gas station. This is where I pulled in and slept fitfully for the rest of the night. No one that I told afterwards believed me, of course. They all asked what I'd been listening to. Lord of the Rings, actually, since the books are so long, and the audio even longer. It keeps me entertained for hours, which is of course fantasy, but I'm pretty sure Tolkien didn't include things like werewolves or man-dogs in any of his work. They also said that I had been dreaming, or was just so tired, I hallucinated the entire thing. My only counterpoint for that would be that until that night, and even after I had gotten home and did research, I'd never even heard of the concept of a Dogman. If I'd ever supposed such a thing existed, not being that familiar with dog breeds, how could I have imagined that exact type of dog that these are made of? I could have just conjured up something like Lassie or Scooby-Doo. I know I did not imagine that thing. It was as real as you or me, and yes, it was nasty. I've always loved Halloween. In some ways, I even prefer it to even Thanksgiving or Christmas. There's something about the dressing up, the anticipation of the night, the little undercurrent of mischief and malice that just makes it fun for me. Plus, I've always been a huge fan of scary movies, so the whole aesthetic is a bit more than tinsel and holly. Many moons ago, when my children were young, I would spend weeks on their costumes. Not as a chore, but because I just loved it. I would ask them well in advance what they wanted to be for trick or treat, and rather than bowling an outfit from the store, I would custom make their costumes. I was always sure to add little details that would make them very special, different, and unique. One time, my oldest son, Peter, wanted to go as Freddy Krueger. I'm not sure where he saw the image because I had certainly never let him watch those movies. But he was obsessed with the idea. So I did what I could. I used an old gardening glove, cut plastic cuts from an old 2-liter bottle to make the gloves in a way that wouldn't be dangerous. I used wax paper and plastic wrap to make a mask for him, the way it would look like scars. But now, my kids have long since grown up, moved away with families of their own. I still look forward to trick or treat, and I volunteer as a neighborhood watch guard in our own little community. My home is truly in the suburbs, where most people know each other, and are well aware that on trick or treat night, they should expect groups of kids to be going door to door in costumes, looking to score large amounts of candy. But, of course, that doesn't make it 100% safe. There's always the random out-of-towner who will come speeding through, or even rowdy teenagers who might use Halloween as an opportunity. You do read about this stuff and see it on the news. My job is to take up one of several posts that the Neighborhood Watch Committee decides on and to just stand guard. Watching the kids walk through the streets, making sure first that they are safe, and second, that they don't cause any mischief. Basically, I set myself up with my own bucket of candy at the checkpoint, and I watch for a few hours. I actually love the job, as it gives me the chance to see all the different costumes the kids and their parents have designed, and to still be right there in the thick of fun, even though my own are long gone. Enough of the backstory, because last year, something changed for me. Now, I know that the first thing people are going to say about my story is costume. I'm standing in a street where for hours I've been surrounded by every manner of ghost, demon, devil, and hobgoblin imaginable. Latex, fake hair, even bedsheets are all around the place that I didn't bat a single eyelid. They'll say that what I saw was clearly just another kid in a suit or a mask, or perhaps a parent, as keen to get in on the action as I was. This is what people say. But, as history has proven, people are wrong. It was nearly 9 p.m. I had hung on, as I always do, to check for any stragglers or kids who had, for some reason, got to a late start. But I hadn't seen any for at least 20 minutes. The last group, featuring an adorable little girl dressed as a pumpkin, had been accompanied by their father. So I just decided to call it quits and head home. But, just as I reached over to fold up my camping chair, I caught sight of this figure standing at the edge of the street. At first, the whole thing was just a silhouette in the streetlight. I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but they weren't. It was there, plain as day, and huge. When I say huge, I mean it. This was no kid. It must have been well over 7 feet tall, and that was the stooping over. It had huge, thick arms, human-like, but covered in hair. But it was the head that got me the most. It was the shape of a dog, and even in the darkness, I could see long, sharp teeth protruding from its snout. I just spent the whole night looking at every variety of mask under the sun, and I'm telling you, this was not a mask. What I saw very closely resembled a werewolf, or some kind of Dogman creature, whatever you want to call it. It was real, and I was face to face looking at it. I stopped packing up my things, looked around, trying to estimate how quickly I could get to the nearest house, whether it be quicker to run behind a tree and hope it had not spotted me. I watched as it lowered its head toward the ground, padded slowly toward the bushes on the far side of the road. After the trees, there are fields, and then it's out onto prairies. I stayed perfectly still and prayed as the thing slowly moved off and disappeared into the leaves. This year, I will still be doing my job on the neighborhood watch. More than ever, there needs to be somebody out there looking for the kids, to protect them. I will stand in that same spot. But this year, as well as a bucket of candy, I'll be taking a can of mace, just to be sure. Back in May of 2002, in Blacksburg, Virginia, I bought my first house a little over a year ago. I'd been living in an apartment for years, basically my entire adult life. I was really looking forward to having a house with a yard, being able to garden, and have campfires. I live in a medium-sized city in Virginia, not far from the Blue Ridge Mountains, so I have the usual urban advantages, but I'm not far from nature either. The house I bought was in a smaller suburb on the edge of the city, and my house backed up against a small forest and creek. Not far away was a much larger forested area. I had a good-sized yard, partially fenced in, and lots of privacy. One of my first goals was to get the backyard all set up. I wanted to host a cookout for my friends as soon as I could. Within weeks of moving in, I began working on the yard. I took care of mowing and weed whacking, then did some simple gardening. Nothing fancy. I bought an umbrella table and some chairs, and also a few camping chairs for the fire. Then, I got to work, digging a fire pit. Once it was in decent shape, I invited friends and coworkers over for a cookout. We roasted hot dogs over the fire, had some drinks, and hung out virtually all night. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I cleaned up the food after everybody went home, but left everything else out until morning. The next day, I went out to finish cleaning and was stunned. My backyard was in ruins. The table and chairs had been flipped over, tossed around. There was garbage strewn all throughout over the yard and shredded up. There were deep furrows in the grass, and the little flower beds I'd planted were now visibly trampled. I took pictures, then began cleaning up. I was able to save the furniture, although it was pretty banged up. There wasn't much I could do about the track marks in the grass, though. I sent the pictures to my parents and some friends, asking them what might have caused this type of damage. Based on the chewed-up garbage, I just assumed raccoons, but the flipped furniture was definitely the work of something larger. And with the long scratch marks in the ground, had to be made by something with big claws. As far as I knew, we didn't have any bears out here, or wolves. Coyotes were my best guess, although it seemed like really odd behavior. No one I asked had any better answer either. I was assuming that the smell of the food was what had attracted the animals, so I did not have another cookout for a while. Instead, I worked on fixing up the fence. A little over half of it was already fenced in, so I got someone to install the additional sections to finish it up. The contractor also shored up the older sections, made sure all of it was sturdy enough to keep any animals out. A few months after the first cookout, I was feeling better. Decided to invite friends over again. Just like before, we had made hot dogs and hamburgers, sat around the fire, listening to music. Between 11 and midnight, most of my guests filtered out. One friend stayed behind me to help me clean up. He knew about the mess last time and was concerned, which was actually nice. We pulled all the food and drinks and garbage inside. I folded up the camping chairs, cleaned everything up as best as I could. I felt a lot better with the fence, but still being cautious. Once it was all done, my friend left. I made sure the backyard light was on and locked up. I tried going to bed, but I was having a hard time falling asleep. Since I lived alone, it was a little freaky thinking of a pack of coyotes, or whatever animal, prowling around my house. I knew I was safe inside. I still felt nervous. After an hour or so, I was almost asleep when I heard the sounds. It was a splintering sound, like cracking wood. It was enough to completely wake me up. My bedroom window looked out over the backyard, so I walked over and looked out. The light was still on, but everything beyond it was in the dark. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary and wasn't sure where the noise had come from. I stayed there, watching, waiting. Eventually, I saw movement. Right at the edge of the light, something dark was moving around, checking out the backyard. It was big, but I couldn't see much more than that. I was too scared to go downstairs for a better look, but was confused as to how it had gotten in the yard. Apparently, it could climb fences. The thing moved around some more. I heard it sniffing around the fire pit, then moving closer to the table. As it did, I could now see it more clearly. Having thick, dark fur, I was beginning to think I had been wrong. Not a coyote or a raccoon. This was a big bear. I was looking down on it, and the thing was hunched over oddly, so I couldn't see all of its body very well. Then, as I watched, it stood up. It straightened up and stood very tall on two legs. When it turned its head, I could see that it had a long, narrow snout. The head of this thing was shaped much more like a dog than a bear. Also, now that it was standing up, I could see that the legs were too long, and the torso too slender to be a bear. I had no idea what I was looking at. Suddenly, it turned and lifted its head to look right at me. I was standing in a dark room. It couldn't possibly see me, but it stared straight at me for several long minutes. Its gold eyes appeared to be glowing in the darkness. I felt hypnotized looking back at it, until I snapped out of its stare, jumped back from the window. I threw myself into bed and hid under the covers all night, like a child, not sleeping once. The next morning, I went outside to check out everything. Saw that part of my fence had been knocked over. Apparently, this Dogman werewolf creature had somehow pulled it down to get into my yard. Needless to say, I stopped having cookouts after that, instead of dealing with whatever that thing was. To give you a little more insight about me, this story occurred when I was 14 years old. I was at my friend Emily's house since, back then, I lived there for personal reasons. Anyway, it was about 1 a.m., and her parents were gone for the night at her grandmother's house. We were watching horror movies and vegging out on snacks, like we usually would, every weekend night. After our movie, I got up to pee and let her know I'd be back. She nodded before opening up her laptop to message her boyfriend at the time. As I walked down her barely lit hallway and came across the bathroom, I heard Emily's voice call out to me to her back porch that was on the right side of the hallway. which immediately struck me as odd, because I'd never seen her leave the room, or even walk past me. And why would she be outside anyway? Her voice called to me again, so I couldn't help but walk out to the back porch. It took a lot to scare me, so I wasn't bothered by this. Turned out to be the biggest mistake ever. A red flag should have went off right then and there when her voice became silent as I stepped onto the porch. I called her name softly, but she did not reply. I called her name once more, but this time louder, and again. Silence. I stepped off the porch onto the grass, looking into her wooded backyard. A little angry now, because at the time, I figured she was trying to prank scare me, like she usually did. It was normal for her to do. But when I yelled her name again, a voice spoke. It wasn't hers. It was another woman's voice. Help me, please. For the love of God, please help me. I heard a woman scream. Now I was officially freaked out. There was no one around for miles besides her one neighbor that lives a little ways into the woods. I found myself not being able to move. Curiosity, maybe. But the bushes started rustling, and what looked like a dog stepped out. My first thought was it was her neighbor's dog that must have gotten out again, because it has happened before. But when this thing stood up on its hind legs, it was easily about 7 feet tall. That's when I really froze. What was I looking at? I asked myself. I've never met any human that's that tall in my entire life. When it started to stalk towards me, I eyed it carefully. It was walking kind of like a human, but wobbling like a baby taking its first steps. I found myself not being able to bolt out of there like I should have. I could not move. That is, until I heard the slider door being opened, and the real Emily's voice speak. Lana, what are you doing out here? I looked around my whole house for you. As soon as she finished her sentence, I bolted as fast as I could, pulled my friend inside before shutting the door and locking it while closing the blinds. I did this to every room, even the basement, locking windows included. All the while, Emily yelling at me, asking me what was going on. I took her arm, raced her into her room before slamming her door behind us. When she finally realized how terrified I was, and just how badly I was shaking, only then did she ask me, "What's the matter? You look like you just seen a ghost. What happened?" I finally calmed down enough to begin to telling her what I had encountered. But before I got the chance to fully explain what happened, I heard extremely loud banging on my friend's window. This stunned us both, and we both shot up, at least 10 feet into the air. I whispered when I realized I forgot to shut her blinds. I didn't have the heart to turn around, but when Emily's face went pale, I didn't have a choice but to look behind me, and I really wish I had not. There was that thing, looking into our bedroom window. I can't even begin to explain what it looked like. All I can come up with is that its body was twisted, like somebody who had just been in a freakish car accident, and it had fur, lots of it. The eyes glowed much like a cat, and a high-pitched noise escaped that thing's throat, making us not only cover our ears, but we both screamed as hard as our lungs would let us. I threw my friend on the floor before zooming into her parents' room to get her dad's rifle. When I came back, the noise stopped, and this creature, was gone. Emily was rocking back and forth, holding her knees close to her in the fetal position, shaking, crying hysterically. She had seen its face as clearly as I did, and the antlers that it happened to have. To say we were absolutely terrified would be a massive understatement. The rest of the night, we had all the lights on in the house, and we stayed huddled together in the living room with the rifle sitting right under my legs. Finally, after what seemed like decades, the sun finally rose, and her parents walked through the door. Almost instantaneously, her dad noticed our fear-stricken expressions and his gun under my legs. They sat down, keeping their soft demeanor, asking us what had happened. When I explained it, they shared worried glances before announcing that they were moving. We never asked why. We were just happy to get out of there. We moved that exact day to my family's vacation home in a very populated city with little to no trees. When my parents got home, and we told them, they had the same reactions, and told me I can never go out after dark alone, and to stay away from all wooded areas. Of course, I never questioned it. To this day, I don't know if it was a skinwalker that some people believe in, or if it was an imposter. What do I know, though? All I do know is that it was not human, and definitely evil and supernatural. Even though I'm 36 years old, I'll never forget this horrifying experience. I was 12 or 13. I know for a fact I was in 7th grade, and I woke up one night to a banging on my window. A quick note, me and my parents, since I'm an only child, lived in a 1-story house in a small suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. When I woke up and looked outside, my blinds were closing my window, but there's a streetlight that comes in, so I can kind of see through my curtains at least the silhouette of the shape of a head, except it had very long pointed ears and appeared bald, and had very spindly fingers as it was pressing against my window, almost like it was trying to push my window open. I felt like my heart was going to beat out of my chest, and I wasn't sure if I should make a run for my door and go to my parents' room, or just grit my teeth and bear whatever this thing was about to do. But then suddenly, it ducked down, and I could almost hear it crouching, going to the other side of my house, to where my parents' bedroom is. Now, I was in complete and total panic. I jumped up, ran out my room, ran to my parents' room, and told them somebody was outside our house. My dad jumped up, grabbed the baseball bat, and grabbed the phone to call 911. Well, the police showed up within 10 minutes. They did a thorough scan and didn't find anything. I kind of looked silly, but my parents believed me. I told them I saw somebody outside my window trying to break in. That's at least all they know. But I believe it was more than just a person. Maybe it was a person in a Halloween costume. Either way, it freaked me out. I don't know if this falls under paranormal or what it is I saw that day, but back when I was 7, 8, and 9, I used to live by this large apartment complex, which was bordered by a large amount of woods. Very often, because my parents would leave, I would go and play with the neighborhood kids in the apartment. There was probably about 4 or 5 of us. We would always usually play hide-and-go-seek in the woods, or just find other mischief to get involved in. Well, one particular summer day, I'll never forget. We were playing hide-and-go-seek, and I was in the process of hiding, when I remember feeling like somebody was looking over at me. I began scanning the area around me, just the trees, and I spotted what was looking at me. I thought it was a person at first, and then I looked a little bit closer. It was the face. It kind of looked like a goblin with very fierce eyes. Some ugly, creeping goblin golem-looking like creature. Once it noticed I was looking at it, for a split second, it continued to stare intently, then ducked its head behind the tree. That's when I freaked out and ran back to my friends, telling them I'm done playing the game. Let's go back to the apartment. There's something creepy in the woods. They laughed at me and tried to convince me to keep playing, that there's nothing out here, and I'm just being a scaredy cat. I didn't budge. We eventually went back to the apartment complex and found a different game to play. I want to say I was probably closer to 8 than I was any other age here. As I got older, I saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, and in it, I believe the first movie, there's a scene where they go into a cavern or a mine. It's right before they fight that big fire demon, or the wizard guy does. And there's all those like goblins or orcs that come in and fight them while they're in the tomb. The face that I saw looked very much like those goblin orc faces, very ugly and very scary looking. I don't really remember how tall it was or how short it was. I definitely know it was about my eye level, so probably closer to 5 foot. I was a pretty tall kid, and it seemed to be about eye level with me. Other than that, I never saw any of its hands or other body parts. That was about the extent of my entire sighting. Back in 2004, when I was with my cousin hunting on his property, we ended up shooting at something that definitely was not a deer, and it was not a bear. Whatever this thing was charged at us through the tree line, barreling like a giant gorilla. It didn't even look like a gorilla. It looked more like a giant dog, but very man-like, if that makes any sense. Like its body was very that of a human, but its face was very warthog-like, and it almost barreled at us like a bear or a dog. It was massive, huge thing. We shot at it several times as it came barreling towards us, and we ran. It jumped back into the trees, and then ran parallel with us through the woodline, for easily almost a mile as we traced our steps all the way back to the road. It stayed hot on our path through the entire game trail, all the way back to my cousin's truck. Even that morning when we had gotten there, my cousin and I had mentioned something was wrong. Something felt off in the air. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, and there was just a thickness in the air. I can't quite describe it. Like an eeriness. We ignored it, thinking our senses were just eerily heightened for some reason. This wasn't different than any other time we'd gone hunting together, so we brushed it off. And then this encounter happened, probably no more than 3 or 4 hours out on the field. We never did see any bucks that day. Actually, come to think of it, we never saw any wildlife, except for this thing, whatever it was. This gorilla warthog man thing. After that encounter, my cousin did not hunt the entirety of the rest of the season, and it had just begun, which is a pretty big deal. He's a huge hunter, but it spooked him pretty bad. God only knows what we saw. My grandmother for years had a small little ranch which she ran with my grandfather, and they had an abundant amount of beautiful horses. They all trained and took care of, all by hand, all by themselves, even in their elderly old age. At some point, my grandfather got very sick and eventually passed. My grandmother, now having all the responsibilities of animal care and life fall onto her solely, she enlisted the help of me and my 2 sisters. Me and my sister, being twins, just graduated high school, and with no college plans ahead, we thought it would be a perfect time to help take care of Grandma, since we were very close with her at the time. My older sister, who's 5 years older than me and my other sister, could only help periodically, as she already had started her budding career. Things went great for the first couple months. That is, until spring rolled around, when we started seeing large gray wolves come onto the ranch and attack her animals. I've known that there are wolves in Wyoming, but I had no idea they were these large. These were huge wolves, easily the same size as the horses, and they would always come in packs of 2 or 3. Very, very large animals, although they looked different than your standard wolf. They were much more slender in the back, and slightly disproportionate body, much more engorged with blood and muscles on the front, just over the top, and their heads were massive, tall, lengthy, spiky ears, and a face that looked very, very mean. They got 2 of my grandmother's horses, tore them to shreds, actually, so old Granny resorted to using some firepower, which seemed to work for some time, but only managed to scare them away, and ultimately make them angry. For about a month, maybe a little bit more, they went away, stopped appearing altogether, and then one night, early June, they came back and tried to break into the house. I remember, me and my sister were sitting down playing a board game. My grandmother was still up, probably doing dishes. That's when we heard the door violently rattle. We were all startled, and my grandmother grabbed the gun. All I had on me was a machete, which I kept on me all the time. It was just nice to have. A very handy weapon and tool. The door was violently shaking, the handle rattling. I peeked out the window and saw this thing pressing its face against the glass, snarling, banging on the door, trying so hard to break it down. My grandmother did something I can't believe she did. She literally put the gun up to the glass and pulled the trigger, shooting this thing right in the face and blowing the entire side window out of her house along with it. This thing ran away in pain, yelping, since she had just shot it point blank in the face with a rifle. She didn't even care that her window is now shattered. She cared more about killing whatever these things were and harming her horses. After it happened, she just opened the front door, ran out to the front porch, and fired at it a couple more times as it ran off into the night. She came back, looked at the window, and said to us out loud, "Who's staying up on watch with me tonight to make sure those things don't come back and try to get into the house?" Me and my sister were shocked. My grandma's pretty hardcore, but this was easily one of her most hardcore moments I've ever seen. She's fearless. She then made a couple cups of tea and stayed up with us until sunrise, until she could call somebody to come and repair the window. When the guy came and asked what happened, she just said there was a minor accident, even though it was obvious. Somebody clearly fired a gun outside the window. Glass shattered everywhere. She said she had to shoot at a bunch of coyotes coming for her horses. We never saw these large wolves much after that. They would show up here and then sometimes, at the very tip of the property line, but they never again tried to mess with Grandma's horses, or even come up on the property much. We never did see the big one that tried to break into the house, which almost did, mind you. It was angry, but having shot it point blank in the face, probably in the eye, knowing Grandma, and how vindictive she is, it probably either died or never had the cojones to return. And for a current 2021 update, my grandma is still alive, has dealt with breast cancer, a sickness, and COVID, and has survived all of it, and is still hard as a rock. What a tough lady. In this case, Grandma 1, Dogman 0. I live right next to a national forest, and there's even a little half-mile trail loop that I usually walk every morning, if not every other morning. But lately, my dog, which is a pit bull, mind you, has been acting very weird, very scared. That's unlike my dog, who acts like he's king of the woods, very proud and strong every time we go on our morning hike. Although lately, the woods do feel a bit out of place. It's been very quiet, and kind of an eerie feeling in the air lately. So, I don't know. Dogs are pretty good about sensing things that are around them. And although I agree, things are a little off. Nothing that I don't think is wrong. But maybe I should trust my dog's intuition, because he probably knows something that I don't. Perhaps a predator is in the area. What would that even be? When I was 15, my father used to have a rather large tool shed, which he, for whatever reason, dismantled the following summer, and rebuilt a new one, much closer to the house. I feel that the reason was because, well, A, he had to walk too far, but B, I think it had something in part to do with this encounter. My dad's kind of a pack rat, and is an avid hunter, So he stuffs all of his junk and stuff in this shed, as well as many things he finds, like deer sheddings and skulls and bones. Anything he finds of interest, he just shoves in this shed. It's kind of a disorganized mess, or was. Well, it still is. I've seen his newer shed, but things have never changed, and it's always been that way. I remember when I was 15 in the summertime, for whatever reason, this werewolf-like creature began being attracted to his shed, and I still will never forget the very first time that I saw it trying to get into his shed. I was up playing video games, and I was alerted by a banging noise over and over. I kind of thought to myself it was probably raccoons, because my dad also keeps our trash cans over by the shed. For whatever reason, I don't know. So it was banging around. After this went on for about 10 minutes, I was kind of getting annoyed now, and was going to go shut my window. I didn't have any AC, so I frequently opened my window at night to let some cool summer air in. As I went to go shut my window, I looked, and I saw this tall, gray, brown, hairy-looking creature trying to break into the shed. My dad keeps a mighty fine padlock on the front, so it's not just easy to get in. He has some of his old valuables in there as well. This thing was violently shaking the shed, ramming its head against it, its body, and trying to break the door down. I freaked out, ran downstairs, ran into my parents' room, and told him, "There's some large animal on 2 legs trying to get into your shed. You should probably see this." My dad, alerted, jumped up, grabs his revolver, and walks outside. The thing is now gone. He now angrily turns his attention towards me, and acts as if I set him up for a prank. It tells me to go back to bed, and unless his shed has actually been broken into, don't bother waking him up. Oh man, I almost nearly got grounded for that one. Whatever. So I went back up to playing video games. Nothing happened the rest of the night. And as the summer progressed, I would keep seeing this thing come back, keep trying to break into my father's little shed, but it never could. It looked pretty large, but I only ever saw it at nighttime. Some nights there was a little bit of overcast, so my visibility wasn't as good. And other nights, the moon would be bright and full, and a starlit sky, and you could see it pretty well. It was fairly tall, maybe taller than my dad, who was 6'5", but it was also very slender. It looked just like a werewolf you'd see out of a movie, and I feel very lucky to the point that I never got its attention. For whatever reason, it just seemed so fixated on that shed, and would spend anywhere from 20 minutes to sometimes an hour just trying to break into it, and then eventually give up and disappear. This would happen at completely random intervals, sometimes a couple of nights a week, sometimes once every 3 weeks. It was random. So I would often ask my dad if he kept any dead animals in there, or, like maybe bones with still meat on them that could smell, and he always told me no. Even the skulls he found and the deer sheddings were pretty clean, so I'm not sure what that was about. Why it was trying to break into the shed, I'll never know. And why it never attempted to come to the house, I don't know. So the summer progresses, and now we get to about the end of August. Well, my dad was out there one night, dealing with something in the shed. I think he was either getting something out, or putting something away. I was doing my usual, playing Xbox up in my room with the window open. I heard him fumbling around. Then it went silent for a bit, not really paying too much attention to what was going on outside. I was more focused on playing Halo 2. Then, I hear him yell, and fire off his revolver twice. And I hear this horrible howl screech thing that sounded so inhuman. It sounded like a beast. I immediately jump up, throwing my controller down and looking at my window. My dad is full-fledged, white as a sheet, running towards the house with his revolver in hand. I immediately run down the stairs to greet him as he's coming in the house. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. Eyes as big as saucers, face completely drained of blood, and I asked him, "Did you see the werewolf thing?" He didn't answer me. He just locked the door and told me, "Listen, you are not allowed to go out at night. Do you understand me? Never." And I said, "Did you see what I saw?" He never acknowledged my question. I feel like he was too afraid to answer me. Anyway, literally within the next couple weeks, he dismantled that shed, started by removing everything in it and moving it by the side front of the house. Then, within a week, had the shed completely demolished and torn down. That was the end of that. Now, the shed is probably no more than 20-30 feet away from the house. A little bit bigger too, and has multiple padlocks on it. And all the way up until I finished high school, there hadn't been an issue with the shed, at least to my knowledge, and seeing this creature. Maybe him shooting at it with a revolver was enough to scare it away. After high school, I moved out and into college. Then after college, I moved away and roommated with some friends. I still visited somewhat often, maybe bi-monthly or bi-weekly, depending on how busy I was. I would ask my dad sometimes, "Does it still come around?" He would just get quiet and then just shake his head no. So it's not like I could get much out of him. Sorry this is becoming so long, but that's my werewolf story. Wappingers Fall, New York. So, I spend a lot of time here in upstate New York. There are a ton of people that I have gotten to know, and they've led me to so many out-of-the-way places I would have never known otherwise. I've spent time on farms, in lakeside cabins. I've slept in communes with my hippie friends. I thought I had seen it all, but nothing prepared me for what was coming. One year, a little before Halloween, a friend had invited me to escape the city for a week to avoid the craziness of the season, clear my head. I was all about it. She told me that instead of staying with her on the commune, we would be heading into the woods, camping out, with nothing but tents and the stars. I remember my mother complaining about me being out in the wild, what she called being with wildlife, but I figured that she just didn't understand. People from the city think there are wolves and mountain lions and bears everywhere when you walk into the woods. So, I just packed my bag, kissed my mom goodbye, explaining that I have been to many places before. This would just be another interesting experience. I wasn't the only person my friend invited, which would help. The more people, the less likely wildlife would bother us, and they say that animals are more afraid of you than you are of them. I just wanted to enjoy my time away, without feeling neurotic. Being in a group of 10 instead of 2 would help ensure that coyotes wouldn't just walk up to us. As the first night of the trip got going, there was guitar playing and dancing. People were gathering around the fire. Some were inebriated, some were not. Personally, I had a few glasses of champagne, but nothing crazy. The fire eventually began to die down, right around midnight, and all the tents in our little clearing between the trees began to fill up with tired hippies. I was getting ready to follow everybody to bed, but I had the urge to just somehow take advantage of the quiet time, sit alone by the dying fire, and enjoy the calm breeze that passed through. Everybody said goodnight as they walked by. Shortly after, I heard a rustling in the trees. I did not think much of it. I figured it was somebody who had wandered back from the woods. But when the rustling stopped and nobody emerged, I took my last sip of champagne, set my glass down. I looked towards the spot where the rustling was coming from, and still, no one. That's when I noticed 2 red dots a little ways into the trees. They were lined up like eyes, but I had never, in any of my travels, seen animals or people with eyes like that. I wanted to get a closer look. I took a few steps toward the trees. The clearing was coming to an end, and the shadows of the trees started covering me. This only made the red dots glow brighter. I looked up at the sky for a moment. There was not much light coming down, because the moon was waning. When I looked back down to the trees, the orbs were gone. I stood still for a moment. Maybe I was seeing things. I didn't usually drink, so I began blaming the champagne. Suddenly, I heard more rustling as the shadow behind me grew larger. I heard heavy breathing coming from behind, and then I felt something warm and wet drip onto my neck and down the back of my shirt. I froze, didn't dare turn around. I stood there, paralyzed for a few seconds. It looked like whatever was behind me was almost as tall as the tree next to me. I couldn't make out much from the shadow because of how dark it was. I could hear from its breathing that it did not sound human. I knew it was too big to be a wolf, so maybe a bear. I figured that a bear would not have stayed silent and would have mauled me by now. Something was very different about this creature. I heard grunting and saw from the shadow that it was moving slowly. I heard it walk away, its footsteps heavy on the ground. I was paralyzed by fear, but I wanted to know what it was and why it spared me. Surely, bears and mountain lions would just attack. Slowly, I turned my body in the direction of the footsteps. What I saw, I can never unsee. There was a large creature. It had to be 8 feet tall, walking across to the clearing on its hind legs. It looked like an extremely large dog. A werewolf, maybe? But the moon wasn't full. I could make out the black fur in the dim lighting of the embers from the fire. I could see a tail, but I could also tell that the muscles of the creature were actually like a man's, kind of like a bodybuilder. I stood there in awe as it walked by the tents, ignoring the people inside. I could see ears perched on top of its head, large and pointy, but since he was walking away, I never got to see his face. There was one point as I turned my body completely around that he seemed to stop. His hearing must have been fine-tuned. I stopped moving too. I didn't even breathe. I watched as he started walking again into the woods, the trees and bushes around him rustling. After a minute, I let myself breathe. When he disappeared, I ran to my tent that I was sharing with a friend and hid myself in my sleeping bag. I never told anybody what I saw. I figured they would think I was crazy. But it's true. I was sure I saw those eyes a few more times on that trip. But I never did see that same creature. At least, not another time. I grew up in Adams, Massachusetts, a town below the highest point in the Berkshires. It is a mountain town, full of families, and all my friends lived close by. Right around the corner, actually. On the 4th of July, 2015, our town had all the parades and parties a family town could ask for. Fireworks were scheduled for the evening, and the smell of barbecue was everywhere. Delicious. I worked in an ice cream shop in town, and, sucky, I had to work during the holiday. But it was fine with me. It would just mean extra money, and tips towards the car I really wanted to buy. My shift ended around 5 o'clock, and I had plans to skip my parents' and neighbors' shindig and go down to the cemetery with friends for some peace and quiet. All the screaming kids, parade music that I'd been hearing the whole day was really starting to get to me. Not after hearing it all shift. I met up with everybody outside my house. We all got burgers before leaving. There were about 5 of us. We all started walking down to the cemetery, eating, chatting, talking about the beautiful weather. The part of town where the cemetery was in a much quieter part. It didn't even feel like we were in the same town. The cemetery wasn't huge at all, but it was big enough that we could find a quiet place to sit, hang out for a bit, and be completely unbothered. Once we were all settled under a tree, I relaxed, just listened while everybody else was talking over one another. I didn't really have much to say since I was still reeling from work and how busy the day was for me. I noticed right then something moving in the distance behind a couple big mausoleums. It was dark, and I could only make out a shadow. I could not tell what I was looking at, but I figured an animal had come down from the mountainside, wandered into town after smelling all the food. Then I saw whatever it was sprint from behind one mausoleum to the next. It looked way too big to be a mountain lion, and too fast to be anything large like a bear. For a minute, it had me startled. I could not imagine any animal. There's no animal I can think of being out in the light of day. Not like this. Maybe it had rabies or something, or mad cow disease, which made it crazy, which in turn made me nervous. One of my friends noticed a change in the look on my face, tapped me on the head, and asked me what was wrong. I didn't want to say I saw a big, scary shadow running around the cemetery. I was sure they would make fun of me when they looked and saw nothing. So, I shrugged it off, said it was nothing, and that I was just so tired. My eyes were simply playing tricks on me. No big deal. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Right then, I saw the figure again. It sprinted back further into the cemetery, this time behind gravestones, and then behind a tree. My curiosity got the best of me at this point, so I played it off like I needed a walk and headed in the direction of the shadow. When I saw it take off again, I noticed it had an unbelievably large stature. I couldn't tell you how tall it was, but I knew it was bigger than any of us, and the quick glances that I got of it reminded me of a man completely covered in hair. I laughed to myself and kept walking. Imagine Bigfoot coming down from the woods. Obviously, that can never happen, right? I approached the mausoleum that it had been hiding behind. I looked down to be sure not to trip and froze. There, in the dirt, was this enormous footprint, the size of my forearm, complete with claws, right there in the soil. I began to panic a little, puzzled by something I did not yet understand. I had never heard of a creature with a footprint so big in my life. I proceeded with caution towards the tree that it had ducked behind. I just needed to know if I was crazy, or if we were actually in danger sitting out there. I got to the tree and found nothing behind it, no one crouching or hiding from us. This is when a cluster of leaves fell from the tree above, hit me on their way down. I heard a loud rustling too. That was not the breeze. I slowly lifted my head to look up. There, glaring down at me, was a hideous dog creature with eyes shaped like a human, but amber-colored and terrifyingly piercing. The dog creature was as long as the branch was, and he was laying on it. I could see drool dripping from his mouth, and he slowly began to growl. I've always read about a Dogman existing somewhere, but like all other monsters, I never thought they were true, just like werewolves. But now, here I am, face to face with this monster. I could even feel his heavy breath enveloping my face with his drool. I was afraid to move at all, thinking any set of movements might trigger him to attack me. Just then, somebody outside the cemetery began lighting off fireworks. The sudden noise startled the creature and caused it to turn. I used that moment as an opportunity to run for my life. I ran back to my friends, told them we needed to go now. They protested at first, but then one of them caught a glimpse of the creature, jumping down from the tree. She did not get a good look at it, only a shadow, but she could tell it was huge. We all grabbed our things and made our way out, quickly. The friend that had seen the shadow asked me what it was. I played it off saying I never saw a shadow, only the signs of a coyote circling around, and felt scared. I knew nobody would believe me anyway, but that's my one-time experience, seeing a real-life werewolf, or, as you would call it, a dogman. I know they exist, especially up here in the Northeast. I lived in one of those rooming situations in a house on the side of a mountain, out there in Colorado, not too far from Boulder, actually. We were only in a house in the surrounding few miles, and my roommates and I were all creatives in some way or another. There was a deck that actually overlooked the beautiful landscape we were by, full of trees, a few waterfalls. Painting is a huge hobby of mine, so I happened to find myself out there a lot, using the area as pure inspiration. One weekend, everybody had left, and I was all alone, the only one in the house. Everybody else had gone away to a retreat, and I decided to take the opportunity to work some of the bigger pieces that I wanted to finish, post online for sale. I spent most of the weekend out on deck, enjoying the crispness of the air, even though it was early spring, and winter would soon be left behind. I was taking full advantage of watching the trees sprout green little buds and leaves. It's incredibly peaceful. Nothing can quite prepare you for how amazing it really is. I would return to Colorado any day of the week. This was all until Sunday night, of course. Nobody was due home until Monday, so I decided to make Sunday a rest day. I did not go out on the deck at all, and I cuddled under a blanket in our huge living room, read some books. The day did drag on, but I was happy. Eventually, I fell asleep, sometime after dinner, book in my lap. I was awakened a few hours later, when it was dark outside now. What awoke me was a very loud banging noise. In fact, it was extremely loud. I was a bit confused, being that I woke up in the dark by a loud noise. I began to set myself up. I didn't know where exactly the noise was coming from, so I waited to see if it would happen again. Sure enough, it did. It sounded like somebody was walking on the roof of our home. I began to get really scared. I was extremely far from help. Nobody would be home until the next morning. Luckily, we had cell service, so if I had to call the police, I could at least get in touch with somebody. I thought I should wait though. Maybe it was something falling from a tree, or blowing in the wind. But my thoughts were interrupted by more banging on the roof. There was no way it was a tree. It had to be someone or something up there moving around. I tried to just stay calm. Assume it was an animal. A squirrel, maybe. Animals always sound bigger than they really are. And there's no way an animal could get in, after all. Behind where I was sitting on the couch was the deck. The doors to it were just glass window panes, so you could see the beautiful view from inside. Next, I heard, as clear as day, whatever it was, jump from the roof onto the deck. Now, it could see me. I wanted to pick up my phone and dial 911. I didn't hear any more movement, so I assumed it was just standing there. I was afraid if I picked up my phone, it would come bursting through the door to stop me. I figured I should turn to see what it was before I jumped to any more conclusions. I turned my head to face the desk, and stopped. I was completely startled by the figure that was staring at me, right there through the glass. It was standing so close that his breath was fogging up the window. It had to be the size of the door itself, easily 8 or 9 feet. I couldn't even wrap my head around it. What was this thing that I was looking at? I was too busy noticing that this wasn't a person, but actually a dog, standing on its hind legs. In the light of the minimal moon, I could see that it was baring its teeth at me, and had a horrible-looking smile on its face. The fur was in patches, black patches, with mangy parts of skin. I don't know what it wanted. It didn't move at all, even as I began to stand up. Its eyes, though, were what really bothered me, beyond anything else. I couldn't help but notice that these weren't exactly canine eyes. They were human-shaped, and had a glow to them. This golden amber glow. It's never left me, and it never will. I moved across the room, and the eyes followed. The snout, I noticed, was short too. Something that is not common in dogs. Kind of like a bear. More up closer to the face. Wider. So I backed up to the staircase and walked backwards up to my room, carrying my phone with me. I didn't take my eyes off this thing until it was out of sight. So I ran into my room, locked the door, threw myself under a blanket and dialed 911, in hopes the blanket would hide me and conceal me. I told the operator there was a large animal on my deck. I described what I had seen. He asked me to kindly repeat myself, and sounded like he didn't believe me. After I described it, he asked if this was a prank call. Out of desperation, I cried out, begged him to believe me, but he told me that it was probably just a wild animal that got lost on its way through the woods. He kindly asked me to go back down, check the deck to see if it was still there. If it was, he would send someone. I made my way out. Nothing in me wanted to go back down there and look, but I knew if I wanted help, it was the only way. As I started back down the stairs, I noticed that nothing was out on the deck. It was empty. This animal had vanished. So I hung up the phone without saying anything, headed towards the glass doors, hoping he wasn't hiding around. Whatever it was truly was gone. I popped on all the lights, made sure everything was locked up. I locked myself in my room, didn't come out until the next day when my roommates got home. It turns out that from the road, you can actually see a spot where this creature landed on the roof. The metal shingles were bent and clearly disfigured. When my roommates asked me if I had heard anything, I played dumb. I told them the night had been windy, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was then that I knew that what I saw was real, and that I wasn't crazy. Now the real question is, what did I see? Back in the spring of 2006, when I was about 12 years old, my dad and I took a trip to Denver, Colorado, to visit my grandmother. We were going to take a plane, but my dad figured it would be cooler to drive. This way we could enjoy the beautiful scenery and sights and sounds along the way, even stopping at points to get some fresh air. We lived in northern Nevada, so it was a long 15-hour ride to Denver. We packed the car and headed out on a weekend in early April. The ride was kind of boring at first. I spent most of my time playing Game Boy while my dad drove. We stopped at local restaurants, took some pictures, and even stopped for a bit at some hot sulfur springs. Once we got further into Colorado, Dad took me on one of the more longer scenic routes. He went to Peak Highway, a road that is only a few miles north of Denver. The road is about 40 miles long, something like that. We would check it out, then continue down to Denver afterwards. It was beautiful there. the trees, the mountain ranges, and the cool, crisp air. We'd gotten there a little late, and before we knew it, night had set in. The road is in the middle of the mountains and does not have any lights. Dad had to rely on the headlights to see where we were going. It got pretty dark out there, and there weren't really any other cars out this late on the highway. There were 2 or 3 that we passed when it was light out, but once it had gotten dark, we maybe saw none. My dad was pretty tired from the drive, and we did not have any signal on the radio. He asked me to talk to him to help keep him awake. I began asking him a bunch of random questions about Grandma and what it was like growing up. We talked for a bit, deep conversation, actually, when suddenly, I thought I could make out a figure in the distance. I wasn't sure, though. As we came closer, I began to see something more visible. It was standing in the middle of the road, with its hand straight out in front of it. I yelled to my dad a bunch of times to stop. I was panicking, and finally, he braked. That's when we saw it. It wasn't a man, but a creature, with hairy hands and long fingernails. It was more like claws than fingernails. Incredibly tall, well over 7 feet, and standing just like a human on 2 legs. It was pretty hairy, but not crazy hairy. You could see its muscles beneath its fur. We could not make out a face. Its hands were still up in the way, protecting it from the light. But its legs had hocks like a dog, and they were long. It lowered its hand, and we saw that it had a face very similar to a wolf, with very striking yellow eyes. It began snarling at us like it was pissed. My dad and I were frozen at what we were seeing. We couldn't get our words out. This thing was sizing us up. Finally, it moved out of the way and took a few steps toward us. This snapped Dad out of it. He put the car in reverse. Well, he threw the car in reverse. It wasn't a kind way of doing it. After he got a bit of distance from it, he turned the car around, sped away in the direction we had come. Him and I were terrified. I asked Dad over and over what that was. He just kept responding, "Calm down, relax." But I began to freak out even more. Outside my dad's window, I could see it keeping up along with us, running right alongside our vehicle. We were speeding down the road, and this thing was keeping up with us, like it was nothing. I yelled, told Dad that it was right there. Go faster, faster. He refused to look over, and stayed focused on driving. He told me to grab the roof handle above my seat, to hold on, and put the pedal to the metal. Literally. I closed my eyes, began praying. We just drove and drove. I couldn't tell you how long. Finally, the car began to slow down. Dad told me to open my eyes. We hadn't realized that we had somehow lost the creature somewhere along the way, but it was gone, nowhere to be seen. We reached Grandma's in the early morning, but my dad instructed me not to mention anything about what we had seen at all. The experience shook both of us pretty badly. My dad and I would only talk about it with each other, reading stories online, trying to figure out and play detective. What was it that we had seen? We debated if maybe we just saw a bear, but we both knew that made no sense, judging by what it looked like, and the speed this thing ran at, and 2 legs? It didn't make any sense. I know bears can walk on 2 legs for a short distance, but they're kind of klutzy. This thing, it was walking on 2 legs so natural, like a human being. I know for a fact bears don't look like that, and they don't have long legs with hocks on them like a dog. My father always reminded me not to mention this story to anybody, afraid that people might think we were both crazy, but I felt like I had to share this with you. We saw this Dogman, and letting you know he exists might help you someday too, or somebody who hears this.